Hey. All right. For the next one of these, I want to talk about this idea I'd mentioned of kind of color theory and how a lot of stuff in life after this counting concept and basically one, two, three, and how everything kind of breaks down along those lines, then tends to break down into these concepts of colors. Because like I talked about before, I mean, initially you have this idea of a thing. Maybe an observer in a state, which basically is the latent potential of all things, but the lack of all things. And in some sense, if you think of that like a color, it's like all colors and lack of them, because basically if all you have is one thing, then there's really no reference point. You can't really define light if you don't have black. You can't define black if you don't really have white. So really, it can't exist or define that. But, if it looks, then basically it would discover that in fact actually, oh yeah, there's these gradations, and in fact, there's these other things that are, slightly less white or slightly less black, and the instant that you have anything like that, any difference that can be observed, then that kind of becomes all the difference. As I talked about in earlier, any bit, basically the whole universe kind of starts to scale to that. And so then basically you can start to see all these gradations. You see that first bit of white, and then suddenly you can notice all the other kind of lesser bits of white around it, and you start to kind of explore into that. And that kind of gets into that first like ring structure where you're like, okay, well now there's like, kind of in a color theory, if you had just a two-dimensional way to describe color, you could start with like a line. You'd have white on one end and black on another, and as you went down towards the middle, you'd kind of get gray. But, then if it like was basically an expanding ring structure like on Mercury, then, you would find that actually as you kind of went to one side or the other side, you'd be like, oh, actually the gray is kind of different a little bit, on the left side versus on the right side. And it's like, that's weird. It's odd. It's like there's actually a change in the gray. And then as you kind of like, explored more out into those ideas, you would actually find out that actually, much like these color spheres, there'd be a whole nother ring, basically, of color there in that equator, and that actually gray is a whole lot more complex than, originally thought. And in fact, actually, there's kind of this aspect where if you go one way, you actually kind of push out into greenness, away from kind of just blah gray. You can push out into kind of redness going another direction, or you could push out into like blueness going another direction. So then you have kind of this color wheel or color sphere that's kind of, radiating down into these colors and then radiating down from those into black. And in a lot of ways, it ends up kind of looking like Magic the Gathering, because it's all just patterns. It's these basic concepts that basically kind of reflect and reflect and reflect down. But a lot of the time we keep picking up the same pattern because internally people judge that as right. Like we all have a compass that basically says like, oh, that sounds right. We associate light with certain things. We associate dark with certain things. We associate blue and green, all this kind of stuff, almost quasi-unconsciously with things. But, it seems right to put them into certain categories. And so then you get a lot of the time, like magic, these kind of gradations where white is this idea basically of kind of just pure energy and light and welling up of life and flowing of all these kind of good ideas and protection and bounty and all this kind of stuff. And black is all of this just negation and removal and destruction and taking everything away. And actually, in some sense, actually absolute gray is the lack of all those things. If you could get to absolute gray, where it's just nothing, it's totally flat, that would be honestly like a lot of these colorless type of things where it's like it's just negate. You can't tell any difference again, and then it cycles back. Similarly, then you'd get like all the kind of what we think primaries. Blue tends to be very much this pure thought land. In terms of like physical features, a lot of these kind of waters, if you go up, it'd be like the airs and the lights above the waters. If you go down, it'd be kind of the darks of the depths. Pure green would be kind of just the verdant bounty of the jungle and life and, things basically springing up in nature. Upward would be kind of this plentiful harvests and all of these kind of like, humans using it for growth and productivity and bounty. And then black would be kind of, the slow drain of decay and nature's kind of natural process of basically eating things away. And then, if you go over to red, similarly, upward is kind of this pure industry and production of humanity and, using basically the fire and kind of capturing it for good. And then black is kind of those dark terrors of the pits, all the kind of nightmares of fire and, how it basically burns everything away and all this kind of stuff. But, still, it's all these expressions. And then everything that we then look at in life, and a lot of times also tends to break out into these kinds of concepts. Like if you have a group of 3 friends, then oftentimes they will kind of break down into these types of symmetries, almost because it's like the easiest way basically to define themselves. Like, if I have a bunch of friends and they're all, say, very athletic, then they might still then be like, well, that group of friends on average is athletic. But then they would probably then break themselves out based on, one who's a little bit more bookish, one who is even more athletic, the captain of the team or something like that. And then one who's much more kind of like, out there, maybe like going out into nature or a Boy Scout or something like that. And they would kind of drop into those kind of like gradations just to give themselves almost personal identity within that friend group. And if you take one of those people and put them into a different friend group, then, for example, they might kind of just become the athletic one of that group, because they were already kind of higher average athletic, but that way that they would differentiate in the new group would be that they would kind of be like, oh, he's the athletic one, which would then kind of make him the very kind of like red, outgoing, kind of ordered, muscular type of thing within that group. And a lot of these kinds of things, this idea that if you have 2 brothers or something like that, or 2 things which are, very close, then in many ways, often the way that they would differentiate would basically be by differentiating in their morals and the way they behave and kind of their values. Like if one brother was very good, then oftentimes the other brother is very bad. And you get this kind of like Thor and Loki type of expression that comes out. Or like if you have 3 sisters, then a lot of the times what you'll end up with is 3 sisters who all kind of express outward in different ways. Because, they'll see, one sister was very kind of adventurous and going and basically just kind of exploring life. One was very kind of like work hard and strive and build kind of an ordered life for myself. So maybe the last one will be like, okay, well, I'll try to strive and find a balance and kind of, I'll be a little bit more reserved, maybe read some, and I'll be maybe the peacekeeper between these ones and things like that. But, it's kind of this natural way that they all see, and it happens in what you would almost say is like a spiritual sense, in that, these people are kind of dividing outward these ideas basically of themselves. But then in some sense, it's just happening in a very material way. They look at what's going on around them. They see, the things that other people have done, the way that they talk and do things. And so they naturally kind of just express in other ways because, they want to find uniqueness. They want to be effective as a friend in some ways. But, companies in many ways often will do this kind of thing too. It's as the patterns just kind of show up and show up and show up and show up. You'll have one who's maybe like the original and they'll be kind of the, eventually the bad guy because they'll kind of come to dominate the market. So then you'll get another one who comes in and they're kind of the white knight. And everybody kind of flocks over them because basically they're kind of the good competitor who's like, we're not going to do evil, we're going to be nice, we're kind of differentiating ourselves because all these other people have behaved so, like, abhorrently. Or, maybe if you have 3, then basically they'll kind of differentiate. One will basically become the one of, like, outdoor trucks and wilderness and nature and all this kind of stuff. One will become, like, trucks for the working man and things like that. And then one will become kind of, more of these like, economical reserve kind of like, the thinking man's truck, It's not really about all this kind of like macho-ness. It's more about, like being smart with what you buy, that kind of thing. Either way, they kind of try to do this in a product differentiation sense because they want to sell stuff to you. And the most effective way is to find a niche or a way that they are different or separate from the other things. And they do that based on the number of other ways that things have already differentiated themselves. Anyways, it's an interesting thing that if you think about it and look about it in life, you'll see a lot more ways that it often expresses itself and kind of comes out.